I was born in Greencastle, Indiana, many moons ago. It seems like forever. Little small community, country town. Um, I was one of the only few blacks in the town, probably 3% African American in a largely white community. I went off to college, Huntington University on a basketball scholarship, transferred to Indiana State. During that time, there's probably a transition in me. I really began to resent a dominant culture, aka white folks, because I had really at Indiana State surrounded myself largely around African American males and really became more indoctrinated in the Black Power movement. Indoctrinated in the Black Power movement. Well, there was a lot of angst for a long time. I didn't get saved till I was 27. I used to have on the front of my car, by any means necessary. And if you know that quote, that's from Malcolm X. And basically what it's saying is black empowerment by any means necessary. So I was completely prepared. Not that I was arming myself and had a cache of weapons stored in my basement, but I was completely prepared for whatever it meant for African Americans to rise to a level of independence and power. I was prepared for that. Again, I was buying into the philosophy, but it wasn't manifesting itself physically in terms of weapons and things like that, or training, things like you see some groups doing now. It wasn't until I to a real knowledge of who I was as a sinner before a holy God that these things begin to play themselves out, and I began to examine and critique, holding every thought captive, right? All these different thoughts I had about culture and people and the world, and how did I put all these pieces together? It was difficult at first because it was almost a brand new thinking, because I'm thinking prayerfully, I'm thinking bibliocentrically. I'm allowing the scriptures to govern and guide me, which was, again, diametrically opposed to whether it be white culture or black culture. The Bible's indiscriminate of those sorts of things. It says this is how a Christian lives in the world. And when these things began to become uncovered about both cultures, what was wrong, what was right, what was good, what should be embraced, it was really rather refreshing for me, because I've got a solid guide that is eternal, that is completely true and completely possible by the Spirit, that I can truly have a heart that I can love another brother because he's a brother who happens to be a brother who's white or black or brown or yellow or whatever the case may be, or have physical handicaps or whatever. I can love you based on something that is radically different than what the world says I should love you for, i.e. we're the same ethnicity, or we're the same gender, we're the same height, we're all basketball players or whatever. None of those things really matter at the end of the day. What's more important is that we're made imago Dei. I am called to love you, and as another believer, now we're united by the Spirit that gives us, by God's grace, truly one blood. We're bathed in the blood of Christ, which is, Paul talks about that, right, in Ephesians, right, with the Jews and the Gentiles. That middle wall has been broken down, that wall of enmity, and that we're truly one united people, kingdom citizens. So that was refreshing for me. It took a little while. It took to try to reconcile all of it and see how all of it works, and deal with my own fears from now being embraced largely in a white Christian environment. Okay, can I trust? What's it going to be like? And how is this going to work? And was it perfect? Absolutely not, because there's sinful people in all cultures. But for the most part, God's grace was sufficient through the whole process of coming out of that journey. And it was hard. I don't want to make it seem like it was easy, but it was possible. Change is possible. Behold, old things have passed away. All things have become new. So my thinking really became new and nuanced as I began to relate to people by God's grace. Well, for me, and probably my brother Mike as well, because when we came to Greencastle, our family was originally from Indianapolis. So we went, and my siblings had it worse than I did, my older siblings. They went from an all-black community to an all-white community like that, and they knew it. It was a sharp distinction between them. I grew up in in Greencastle, so for me, all I knew was white culture. I was a 70s rock guy. You know, I listened to 70s rock as well as Michael Jackson and some hip hop and things like that. But I was what's called acculturated. I didn't know anything other really than white culture. From kindergarten up, I had been around dominant culture for so long. In a strange way, their thinking was my thinking. What they thought about certain things in terms of life and liberty and the pursuit of happiness, I began to take on as well, even sometimes where it was offensive towards people of color, which was rather strange the way that sort of worked out. So as a young boy, we all knew, as most African Americans did in our little town, where not to go. Rockville, Indiana was a place that was infamous for Klan activity. Martinsville, Indiana was a place that was infamous for Klan activity. So we were told never go to those towns. When we had, through sports, we played both of those teams in sporting events, we knew what was coming when we had an away game. We knew what was going to be said. We knew what we would hear. Thank God the officiating was still fair. I didn't hear much stuff on the field. I was a fairly decent athlete, so I could, especially in football, you can usually, there can be repercussions to actions on the football field. Hopefully you know what I mean by that. Not that I had to do any of that, thank God. But we knew that we were out of town quickly. We didn't hang around. We never went there to hang out. It just was something that my father instilled in us, that wisely, that's not a place you want to go, and try to really make sure that you're safe. So don't go there. And that just was kind of normal for us. A book that changed my life was the autobiography of Malcolm X. And Malcolm X talks about that early in his understanding that he began to take on what he would refer to as the slave master's mentality. And he talked about how slaves would say, we're going to do this, boss. And they would be a slave, but they would identify with them. I understood that. And when those veils really got lifted from my eyes about what I was doing, that's where the anger and the angst came in. Like, wow, I was not only mad at myself, I was mad at culture. I was sort of even mad at my parents for putting me in that situation where I had been left out, seemingly, from African American culture, from black culture, because they wanted a better life for us, which they worked for IBM, and it was a much, much better life for us, thank God. But so I can definitely, Jeff, say I identify with that whole idea of being in a black body but thinking white. That's how we would refer to it probably now. And it was rather difficult transition, because you really begin to ask yourself some fundamental questions like, who are you? And again, I wasn't a Christian, so I'm not identifying. I went to church, but I wasn't identifying with anything that was gospel related. It was all completely racial related, that because I'm thinking white, then white thinking does this. Well, when that changed in a strange way, well, now that I'm thinking black, this is what black thinking does, as opposed to either of those two thinkings being biblical or gospel centered. They were diametrically opposed oftentimes from the gospel. Well, I think we're seeing played out what the scripture says is going to happen in the last days, and the last days have been since Jesus, his ascension. It's been the last days. Is this just civil unrest, animosity in families, in culture, and it manifests itself in various ways, ethnically, politically, all sorts of different ways. We see that. So we're in a mess, but we've always been in a mess. And the gospel is bigger than the mess, whatever the mess is. And the gospel has the ability to overcome the hardest of hearts, the most difficult of situations. The resurrection provides hope to families, to cultures, when the gospel is focused on. But if the gospel gets lost, that's the battle. Is the gospel going to remain front and center, or are we simply going to try to only appeal to ethnic reconciliation? Are we only going to try to appeal to political reconciliation, as opposed to men are estranged from God? The heart is deceitful above all things and desperately wicked, Jeremiah tells us. And what the heart needs is reconciliation to God. Augustine would talk about that God-sized hole that needs to be filled. And until it's filled with that, there's going to be all that we see in our world today. And it's rather hard to watch and difficult to watch. But what gives us hope is that God is on our side, not in the sense of we've got this great sword that we can come in and chop everybody down, but in the sense that the power of love, the power of compassion, the power of truth is on our side, that we can come into culture, i.e. Paul at Mars Hill, right? As he's in Athens, he sees all these gods. He is disturbed by what he sees. I think the problem is if we're not disturbed by what we see, or if we think, again, if I get my guy in the White House, or if I get this group to get along, if people will just stop protesting, well, everything will be fine. No, they're still potentially lost. And Paul sees that these people are lost and they're God worshipers. People are worshiping all sorts of things. But what they don't have is what Paul would refer to as this unknown God. We need to present the clear God of the Bible and all that he is doing and all that he is. So as discouraging as it may be, I'm encouraged because I know God is still at work and he's pleased to use sinful people like ourselves, those of us who are pastors and preachers and Christians. He is pleased to use us in the changing of culture.